Today's guest is a fourth-generation psychic medium who communicates with spirits. He's an Oxford-educated attorney who's licensed to practice law in Florida, Washington DC and before the United States Supreme Court. He travels to mystical locations in remote corners of the world to examine ancient mysteries and supernatural phenomena. In addition, he's written best-selling books including Evidence of Eternity and his most recent work, The Afterlife Frequency. Please give a massive Koit welcome to Mark Anthony JD, Psychic Explorer, aka the Psychic Lawyer. Hi Mark, and welcome to KoitCast.
Thank you, Koit. It's really great to be here. I've been looking forward to this interview.
Oh, I have too. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm honoured to have you here, so thank you for coming. The one I always start with, who are you, where are you from, all that good stuff.
I'm known as Mark Anthony JD, Psychic Explorer, and people ask me, what does that mean? I used to be known as the Psychic Lawyer because the media loves to give me labels. I was in New York City at a press conference, and somebody said, Mark Anthony, you're a psychic medium and you're a lawyer, so they started calling me the Psychic Lawyer. Then during the course of my career, I'm on so many interviews and speaking at expos on various topics like ancient mysteries, supernatural phenomenon, near-death experiences, the science of afterlife communication, that I started being labeled the Psychic Explorer. So we took my law degree, Juris Doctor, JD, and compacted it. Mark Anthony, JD, my law degree, Psychic Explorer. And I hail from the East Coast of Florida, but I spend a lot of time on the U.S. West Coast in California as well. I've got a nationwide tour coming up, and I appear every week. I co-host the live stream show, The Psychic and the Doc. My co-host, Dr. Pat Basili, is the head of Transformation Network and a world-renowned behavioral psychologist. So people call in, and I'll do a mini reading for them in tandem with Dr. Pat's no-nonsense uplifting insights. And he's asking who I am, fourth generation psychic medium. These abilities run in my family. I write about them in my three books, which are all bestsellers. The Never Letting Go is the first one, then Evidence of Eternity, and my most recent, The Afterlife Frequency. And I'm very honored that both Evidence of Eternity and The Afterlife Frequency have been submitted and considered for Pulitzer Prizes. So I'm an expert in supernatural phenomenon, near-death experiences, because I had a near-death experience myself, but also in spirit communication as a psychic medium. And in fact, this year I'll be giving a number of talks on different aspects of spirit communication, but I combine science and faith. So in a condensed version, that's what I do.
That's a lot of stuff, but thank you for going through it.
It keeps me busy.
You know one thing, right? I know this is going to make me look silly, but I feel I'm going to say it anyway, is that when looking through your bio and stuff, you refer to fourth generation psychic, and I never knew what that meant, right? And I thought, what does that mean? Is that some sort of like special title? But it's not, is it? You're just saying you're the fourth member of your family, aren't you?
Of the fourth generation that we can track. Both my parents had these abilities. On both sides of my family. My father was a U.S. Navy SEAL, and then after the Navy, he went into aerospace and became an aerospace engineer. So it's not like he was wearing a turban and running around and flinging granola at people's, I mean, this was Dad was a real no-nonsense guy. And then my mother's family hailed from Italy, and she was a psychic medium. My dad was a medium. And then tracked these abilities on both sides of the family back into the 1890s. So that's four generations. I'm assuming, Koit, that it goes back even further, but it's very difficult getting records from them.
Yeah.
And I mean, we could spend the whole episode talking about the psychics in my family and the things that had happened to them. And if people are interested in that, I write about that in all my books. So when I say fourth generation, my father had four siblings, three sisters and a brother. He was a medium, and one of his sisters, Marjorie. Their mother, Isabel, and their maternal grandmother, Grace, were all mediums. On my mom's side of the family, she was a medium, as was her grandmother, my maternal great-grandmother, Giovanna. And Giovanna was actually featured in a PBS, Public Broadcasting Systems special called The Italian Americans back in 2016. And they actually did an entire segment, not only on Giovanna, but on her psychic abilities. And it's really fascinating. She was known in the Italian community as the woman who knows things. And
That sounds scary.
well, it does, but people would come to her. In fact, she was actually treated with great respect by the Catholic Church and church officials. I mean, we're talking priests, monsignors, bishops, and even a cardinal would come to have discussions with Giovanna about theology and the afterlife. So on my mother's side, the Italian side of the family, this was looked at as a gift from God. My dad's family, they came over from the UK, from England in 1693, and they were firmly established in Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, and the abilities ran through that family, but being good white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they kind of kept it under wraps. It wasn't discussed openly, although everybody in their town knew about the family.
The gift, yeah.
So when my dad gets out of the Navy, he's at a USO dance, all right? So here he is, this, 23-year-old, full of himself, Navy SEAL, and he said, I saw this foxy looking dame, and he was talking about my mom. And it's funny is he thought she was like 30 because she was so elegant in the way she dressed. Well, my mother was in fashion design and she worked for a high-end retailer, so she got all the best clothes. And she was only 19, and they danced, and then they met at a couple other dances, and they felt that there was a connection more than just the, I think you're attractive. And my mother said, she said, look, before this goes any further, you need to know something about me. I see spirits. And she was cringing, waiting for his response. And he said, oh, dear God, I do too.
That's
so
quality.
I would say that was, so they got that connection. And then from what we can tell, Koit, with friends of mine who are mediums, that this appears to run in families. And it also appears to be what is known as a recessive genetic trait. A dominant genetic trait, like in my family, would be brown eyes and brown hair and being right-handed, okay? There are left-handed people in my family, and there are people with blue eyes, but that would skip a couple generations, ergo a recessive trait. It's the same thing with intellectual, athletic, artistic abilities, and ostensibly psychic abilities. So when you get two parents with the same recessive trait, the likelihood of one of their children having that trait increases exponentially. And I've got an older brother and an older sister, and they have a bit of it, but I apparently got the full kahuna.
Quality. Now, that throws open this question then, right? Is psychic ability only limited to certain families? I.e., can it appear randomly in families where it isn't there?
I believe it can appear randomly. I mean, if you look at like Albert Einstein's family, his grandchildren and all that, none of them show his genius trait. Okay, so that was obviously a genetic thing. Everybody is capable of having a psychic or mediumistic episode or a connection. We all have the same physiology. This is not magic or hocus pocus. There's a sound scientific and physiological basis for this. But not everybody's a psychic and a medium. For example, you and I can probably pop a tennis ball around on a tennis court, but which one of us is going to be Roger Federer? You see what I'm saying? We can all do math, but who's going to be a Neil deGrasse Tyson? So people have different abilities. We can all swim, but how many of us are going to win 12 gold medals in the Olympics for swimming? And it's just that some people are better at this than others.
Okay, cool. Now, I'm going to park the psychic side of things and ask you about your origin story, your personal origin story. So, what brought you into the paranormal theatre? What is your origin story, if you will?
Well, when I was 3.5 years old, I started seeing spirits, and I was interacting with my so-called invisible friends, which is not unusual for a toddler, but when mommy and daddy can see them too. And I do recall I'm laughing because I'll never forget this. Mom said, "Oh my gosh, he's got it." And my dad goes, "Oh, for God's sakes, he's got it." Because
Yeah.
they had very different reactions. And my dad wasn't angry with me. He was worried. He was afraid for my well-being. And that's a whole nother story because of what happened to his sister Marjorie, if you'll let me.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, his sister Marjorie was an extremely sensitive and gifted psychic medium. And unfortunately, she married a religious zealot, and he looked at her ability. He was frightened of them. And he worked at a steel factory in Pennsylvania. I think it was in Harrison, Pennsylvania. And one day he was a machinist there, and he was getting ready to go to work. And Marjorie said she didn't want him going to work, and that she's getting pains in her stomach, and because we receive information in the solar plexus, that's one of the two receptor areas. And she basically threw a fit, and she said, "You're not going to work." And he got very angry, "You and your voodoo stuff," and he stayed home. He placated her. Well, that day, Coit, a crane was lifting thousands of pounds of steel beams, and all of a sudden the cable snapped and the steel beams crushed the machine shop that he worked in and killed everybody in it. Now, theoretically, had he been there, there's 99% chance he would have been killed. Now, one would think that he would be somewhat grateful, but all this did, Coit, is it intensified his fear of my Aunt Marjorie and her abilities. And one day he conspired with a psychologist, a psychiatrist. Now, this was about 20 years before I was born. And I didn't know all this. I mean, I had to learn this, through the grade. This is one of those things that wasn't discussed in the family. And literally, two men in white jackets in an ambulance came to Marjorie's home, forcibly removed her, put her in a straitjacket, and took her to a mental institution. And she was involuntarily subjected to electroshock therapy for a period of over 6 months. Whoa. Until she no longer talked about seeing spirits or anticipating future events.
What a way to repay that gift of life.
Yeah. And but through our history, when I say our history, that of psychics and mediums, it has largely been a history of persecution. Although there are times it's been used and venerated throughout history. And that's one of the lectures that I give, is called Rulers, Royals, Psychics, and Spirits, the mystics behind the thrones of power. And I go into, like, from ancient times all the way up to, from what we can tell, 1/3 of US presidents have had some form of psychic advisors. What's cool is, on the other side of the big pond in the UK, the British royal family has been invested with psychics for centuries.
Yep. And
Winston Churchill used to regularly go for readings he was one of those people who believed he was a child of destiny, and he used to go for readings as well. And because British evidential mediumship is a really wonderful technique, because in the 19th century, it was determined that, okay, there are people with these abilities. So there was, like, Arthur Findlay, who founded the Arthur Findlay College for the Advancement of Psychic Science in Stansted, England, and others. They put together a protocol for, when working with spirits, that you have to receive evidence, verifiable facts that could be documented, as opposed to, oh, your grandmother's around and she loves you. Well, everybody's granny loved them, and chances are everybody's granny baked muffins or something, but you have to start giving details. And that's why, being an attorney, when I heard about British evidential mediumship, that's why I wanted to work with British evidential mediums. And I've developed my own technique, but it's all evidence-based. And it's like, everybody, you learn the basics of any skill and then you make it your own. So that is my family's history. All right. Meanwhile, back to me. So here I am, this
back to the important one. Yeah.
Well, it's like, I like to honor the people in my family that came before me, because nobody does.
No, fair play.
And Marjorie should never have been treated that way. and nowadays, at least, I mean, there's a show like this where we're openly talking about this, whereas 30 years ago, this was a fringe element, only in the side, you'd be in some opium den, talking about this, but that's no longer the case. And it is now being studied in laboratories. I've been in several laboratories in the subject of many scientific inquiries. And so throughout my life, I always had these abilities, and I was drawn naturally to the clergy. I was raised in the Catholic faith. I don't really consider myself Catholic now because I study all the religions, and I've always studied religion and the study of God and the afterlife. And I thought I wanted to go into the clergy, but I felt that there were too many rules and regulations, so I became a lawyer instead. And
for more, yeah.
Talk about jumping out of the fire right into the frying pan. And then throughout the practice of law, I always had a bit of a reputation of this guy kind of knows things that he shouldn't know. It was particularly like when I'd be selecting juries at the beginning of a trial. In the UK, you have barristers. I was essentially a barrister. And I wish they'd do that in the United States, because there's a lot of people that should only be solicitors and who should never be in a courtroom because they don't know what they're doing. But for the barristers, the trial attorneys, at the beginning of a trial, before we start taking evidence, both sides, the plaintiff or the prosecution, if it's a criminal case, and the defense in civil or a criminal case, we each get to ask prospective jurors questions until we can narrow down the prospective jury panel to the 12 jurors.
Your chosen 12,
and 6, And I seem to know things about the jurors that other attorneys didn't, and there's more to that. I mean, I could go on and talk about that quite a bit, but what the pivotal point was, my mother and I, my parents and I were always very close. They have both passed on. But I was always really, really close with my mom because she was really into, we'd go out to lunch and we'd kind of look at people's auras and things. It was just sort of a fun thing that we did.
Sure.
But I was in my law office, and it was about 5 miles from where my parents lived. And I was thinking about spaghetti. Now, okay, I'm an Italian boy. It's not unusual to think about spaghetti, but I was like, God, I'd really like to have spaghetti for lunch. And the phone rings, or rather my secretary puts through the call from my mom. She goes, honey, I just made spaghetti for lunch. Would you like to come over? And I said, sure. Okay. And when I was having lunch with my mom, it was wonderful. Boy, it was just a beautiful, beautiful lunch. My dad was there. Mom was there. We're laughing. My mom looked really tired. And before I left, she hugged me and she said, I'm so grateful you're my son. I said, oh, Mom, I love you too. And I hugged and kissed her. But something didn't feel right. And not with, not about her, but something didn't feel right. And the next morning, Koit, I was in court and the judge's assistant came into the courtroom and said, Mark, we need you in the judge's chambers right away. And when I went in there, it was a phone call from my office that my mother had died.
Oh, no.
And I have her heart gave out in her sleep. And I think she knew the end was near. And because later on, when I found out that day, she called my brother and had a nice talk with him. She called my sister, it was as if she knew somehow that she was leaving and she wanted to say goodbye to everybody without really saying goodbye. Well, even though I'm a medium and I can communicate with spirits, people have a mistaken belief that my grief somehow bounces off of me. It doesn't. It hurts. It hurts me as much as it does everybody else. And yes, I know my parents have moved on and all that, but it's still the physical sense of loss. And a couple of weeks, I think it was about 3 weeks after that, Koit, I was coming back from court. I was driving from the courthouse back to my office. And grief's a horrible thing. And sometimes you think you're managing it, and then all of a sudden it's like a wave, and it hits you. And one of those waves hit me, and I said, I have to pull over. I pulled over into there was a little store, and I pulled into its parking lot, and I said, I got to get my act together. I can't walk into my office and crying. And all of a sudden this flash of light goes off in the car. And the thing is, was it light in the car, or was it something I was seeing in my head? And instinctively, I looked at the passenger side, and there was the silhouette of my mother in the silver white light. And so I'm trying to process this, and her voice fills my head. And I heard in her voice, Mark, you have been given the gift of mediumship so that you will not be crushed by grief, but now you must help those who are suffering with theirs. All right, so Koit, I am reeling from this and I'm breaking out in a sweat because this is pretty heavy duty. And then all of a sudden I hear her voice again and she said, Mark, it is your life's mission to help people understand that God exists, that heaven exists, that souls are immortal living beings, that humans can communicate with souls, and that all of us will be reunited in the light when it is your appointed time to leave your world. All right, now I'm drenched in sweat, and the only thing I could say was, okay. and I'm sitting there, and Koit, I'm thinking, I can't tell anybody this. They're going to think I'm a stark raving lunatic. Yeah. It's like, I can't, I'm just a senior partner of a law firm. So I'm trying to assemble this. And then it dawned on me, this was one of those life-changing moments. And I always find it humorous when I talk to people, say, oh yes, the change in my life, it was this gradual thing. I was sitting on this mountaintop in Maui in Hawaii. And look, my family's Italian. There was no sitting on a mountaintop in Maui. It was like a fire hose right to my face. Okay, boom, this is what's happening with you. And the thing is, right after that, everything started changing. And not long after that, I was offered a job at a government agency. And it's like, okay, this is very convenient because now I was able to sell my law practice, because the law practice is a 24/7 type of thing. And so I'm working at this government agency, and then I start working on my first book, Never Letting Go. And I went to England, and I was at Arthur Findlay College. And as I was getting ready to leave, three of the tutors, that's what they call the professors there, the tutors. I wish,
Actually, they don't call them tutors, Mark. They call them tutors.
Tutors. Okay.
Chew with a ch.
Tutors. Okay. And they said, Mark, we need to speak with you. And I said, okay. They said, you're going on the world stage with this. And I'm like, what? And they said, and it's going to take you down roads you can't even begin to fathom, but have no fear, you'll be able to handle this. So I'm like, okay. And try keeping a secret in a psychic school. All right. So I'm walking down the hall, and I have two of my colleagues. They're both from Scotland, and one of them Jane, and the other one's Simon. And Simon comes up to me, goes, and Simon was cool. He has red hair, long red beard, and he wore a kilt. I mean, he looked like he just like jumped out of Braveheart, And he comes up to me and goes, so I hear you're Harry Potter now. And he goes, does that make me Ron? And then Jane goes, can I be Hermione? And like I'm laughing, it was just great. I just love these guys. And I get back to the States, and I'm back in my law office, and I'm not even in my office for an hour. And my literary agent calls and said, Mark, they just picked up the contract on Never Letting Go, like a publisher. So now my book's coming out. So then I have to go on a book tour. So I'm taking time off from the government agency. I'm taking my vacation time. And my manager, Rocky, she got me a speaking gig first in New York City on MSNBC, and which is really cool because we were in the studio right next to where they filmed Saturday Night Live, and it was just kind of neat being there. And then she got me a speaking engagement at Harvard, and to talk about the afterlife and sign copies of my book. So here we are at Harvard. It's a couple weeks before Christmas. And I remember we're walking around with some steaming coffee, and it was cold, but everything was decorated for Christmas. My cell phone rings, and it's the elected official, the head of that government agency. And he's like, Mark, you are taking too much time off. And he said, and the Republican Party is complaining that the county has a psychic on the payroll. And he was just going off on me and everything. And I said, yeah, but this is legitimate time off. And he's going on and on. And I said, let me make this easy for you. And he goes, how? I go, please consider this my resignation. And he goes, okay. And then I hang up my phone and I look at Rocky and I said, Rocky, I just quit the legal profession. And she said, Mark, take a look around. Where are you? I said, Harvard University. She goes, and what are you doing in an hour? I said, Well, giving a talk on the afterlife and signing copies of my new book, Never Letting Go. And she said, don't you think this is exactly where you're supposed to be? So that, Coit, is how I left the legal profession and then embarked on this career.
On a different path, yeah.
Different path, and I'm a firm believer in synchronicity. I do not believe in coincidences, but I believe in synchronicity, that you are guided by various forces and things to pursue a particular path. And I've taken this even further, and I call this spiritual synchronicity. And that's a term I developed and write about in my books. And from the time of my mother's death through her major visitation to me, and this is just two of the things that happened, that redirected my path. And I have no regrets for anything being in the legal profession or anything I did before, because all of those experiences were necessary and gave me a transferable skill set that I am now applying to my lecture series, the shows I do, the TV appearances, the readings, and the research that I do. So,
yeah, I know those events that you mentioned, they're clearly big nudges to knock you in a different direction. And it almost seems as if you were given a mission rather than you chose a mission. Do you think, had you not have been nudged in that way and physically, well, not physically, but given a mental mission to do, would you have chosen it, do you think?
That would be very difficult to answer. But I think at some point I probably would have, because what was happening is after, I mean, I always had these abilities, but after mom's passing, it started intensifying. And I think at some point I would have chosen it, but it could have been 2, 3, maybe even 5 years down the line.
Yeah.
But the forces beyond me put me in the right place at the right time. And think of one of my historical heroes, Winston Churchill. All right, throughout the 1930s, he was at the House of Commons saying his sources said Germany was building an air force. They're rearming and they're doing it secretly. Everybody looked at him as this guy, he's in his early 60s. He's a washed up has-been. All right, so then May 10th, 1940, Germany invades France, Netherlands, and Belgium. Neville Chamberlain basically steps aside. Churchill's appointed. Now, most people think Churchill's just going to run up the white flag and cut some type of deal with Germany, particularly after the defeat of the French military. But synchronicity and the powers that be had something else in mind. And when I was at the Imperial War Museum in Churchill's bunker in London, and I recommend everybody do that. And they have films of his secretaries. So they're very old ladies. They were recording them and filming them in the 1960s and 70s. And there was something written by General Ismay, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff. And he said that Churchill was an insufferable bully and a tyrant, and he was always yelling at us and berating us. And it was the greatest honor of my life to serve under him, because any other British politician would have surrendered to Adolf Hitler.
Yep.
And it's like he was thought to have been some washed up has-been, but no, he was positioned perfectly to be the right man in the right place at the right time.
Yes, and I agree with that. But part of me, right, always thinks, does that mean humanity really has choices, or do you think we're always nudged by the players up there somewhere?
That is a
think.
Yeah, Coit, that's a fascinating philosophical question, and one that comes up a lot. There have been many times in my life when I made conscious decisions, some of which led to very positive things, others which not so much. And I think that the way spirits have described it for me, there's a day we're coming in and a day we're leaving this world, a day we're going to be born and a day we're going to die. And that's kind of etched in stone. What we have control over is what we do with the time in between. And Churchill very easily could have retired and lived the life of a country gentleman. I could have decided that, well, this metaphysical stuff, it's nice and all that, but it really isn't for me. And I did go to law school and I've been practicing and I should stay with that. So I do believe that we're given a choice, but we're also given signs. And the challenge is, do we recognize the signs and do we listen to them? Now, I want to say something about signs. The world's a chaotic and crazy place at times. And there are some people who feel they're receiving a sign to go commit some destructive act. Okay, you see this with radicalized terrorists and political people. What you have to understand about messages from spirits, they are never controlling, they are guidance, and they're never about anger, bigotry, hatred, or violence. Messages from spirits are always about peace, love, healing, and protection. So if you say, oh, a divine power has told me to take this airplane and fly it into a building, no, that is not a spiritual message. That's a message coming from your own ego, edging God out. Ooh. Spiritual messages will never tell you to wage war. They will never tell you to discriminate against another person, never to hurt somebody. And so when signs in your life arise, and they guide you to a positive path, then that's spiritual. But when you look at the great spiritual teachers, Buddha, Jesus, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Yogananda, Paramahansa, we could go down the list. The spiritual path is not always an easy one either. And that's because we learn from, you can call them mistakes. Learn from our poor choices, learn from our mishaps, but also we grow in response to adversity. And yes, if you didn't have a terrible loss in your life or something, why would you want to change? If everything was just happy and wonderful all the time, you'd stagnate.
Of course you would, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very similar with the old roller coaster metaphor. You can't have the ups without the downs. You've got to learn from experience to, improve, haven't you, essentially, at the end of the day. Right, now, you mentioned the war earlier, what with Churchill and Hitler and all that. I was going to say good stuff. It's clearly not good stuff, but you know what I mean.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was major stuff, yeah.
Yeah, information-wise. But let's segue slightly from there into a story of red light demons, which I was fascinated when I heard you go through this subject on Dave Schrader's show. I couldn't believe it when I heard it. I didn't believe what you're saying, but it's an unusual story. So could you go through what red light demons are and how it came about?
Red light demons, and I want to preface this with I've tried to get independent verification of this, and I've yet been able to do so. Okay. Red light demons has a very, very lengthy history. Back at the turn of the 20th century, cartographers and astronomers were using telescopes to start taking pictures of stars. And they realized that visible light was too limited, so they developed dicenen dye. And dicenen dye is a red dye, and you dye lenses, and all of a sudden now you're able to see the infrared spectrum. See, when we see colors, think of a rainbow. You have purple, then blue, then green, then yellow, then orange, then red. Okay, those are the lights, the colors in the visible spectrum. And the strongest and most intense frequency with the highest power is the ultraviolet, which is the violet. The lowest frequency is infrared, which literally means before red. And so in the infrared spectrum, all of a sudden, wow, we're seeing all kinds of stuff. And now the Webb telescope, which is bringing us incredible incredible images from deep space, and it uses the infrared. It doesn't use the visible light spectrum. All right, long story short, once again, World War II. At the beginning of World War II, the good old Germans started inventing night vision technology and that's one of the reasons they were able to achieve so much success, particularly against the British and French armies in the invasion, because they had night vision technology and the Allies didn't. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, U.S. is watching this. We meaning the U.S., started developing night vision technology. All right, so here comes the Vietnam War 20 years or so after World War II. And there is an urban legend that night vision goggles that utilize Dysenin dye treated lenses.
Yeah.
Typically, now we're seeing green light being used in night vision, but red light has a number of advantages. When you put on a red light goggles, your eye does not have to adjust from day vision to night vision. There's a seamless transfer. Also, red light stimulates the brain, increases reaction time, decreases inflammation in the eye, and there is this really great acuity. Now, green night vision goggles, the human eye can see more shades of green than any other. We can see something like 1 million different shades of green. And the thought on that is it's evolutionary. Think about primitive humans tromping around in the woods. We got to find food and watch out for the leopard in the tree and all that. Okay, so you got to be able to see this. So according to this guy named Cliff, and he's appeared on a video, and there's some articles about him, but he's real hard to track down. He said his father was in command of a helicopter squadron, and the U.S. Army had issued a bunch of these night vision goggles. And at first, the troops were really enjoying them, but then there were complaints of behaviors. The troops were becoming quarrelsome. They were staring at trees. And there was this squadron flying over an area that was not a war zone. They're on a routine patrol, and suddenly, and the officers and the pilots were under strict orders not to use the red night vision goggles, but the gunners could. So it got dark, and the gunners put on their night vision goggles, and all of a sudden, Cliff said his father was the commander of this squadron. He's in this one helicopter, and this young gunner starts shooting at something, screaming, "Monsters, monsters!" And he wasn't shooting at something on the ground. He was shooting on the same trajectory as the helicopter. Now, the other choppers start, evasive maneuvers. And the officer says, "Take that damn thing off." And he goes, "There's monsters, there's devils." And so the officer takes him off and he puts him on. And he goes, "Holy," and he described what looked like gargoyles, these creatures with these, shriveled faces and horns and wings that were flying next to the helicopters. And apparently they could tell that if you're wearing these night vision goggles, you could see them. According to this urban legend, other reports of monsters, and they seem to be flying out of trees. So this whole incident occurred within a 60-day time frame, and the U.S. military confiscated all of these red night vision goggles. Now, since going public with that, both on Dave Schrader's program and on Coast to Coast AM, I've received a number of emails from U.S. military veterans of the Vietnam War saying they never heard of that. This is hogwash. But then I've heard a couple that say, "I know where you can get hold of Cliff."
Oh, have you spoken to him, have you?
I've tried to, but nothing seems to get through. So, did this happen? Look, I'm just relaying what the story is.
Sure.
As a researcher and an author, and I like to be taken credibly. That's why I'm telling people I've yet to independently verify this. But let's back up a bit. Gargoyles. Are they demons? Are they evil? See, just because something may appear to us unpalatable or frightening looking doesn't mean it's necessarily evil. Human beings have been documenting contact with human animal type hybrids for thousands of years. I've got a bunch of Egyptian artwork behind me.
Yeah.
so many Egyptian gods were like half crocodile, half human, half falcon, half human, so on and so forth. Um, Celtic, the Celtic belief systems, you have gargoyles, which is a French word, gargouille, okay? The Roman mythology, Pan, the god Pan looks a lot like a gargoyle. It's got, from the waist down, he's a goat, and the head up, he's got, horns. But in every society there, throughout the world, there's some type of entity like this. They can be called gargoyles, pixies, sprites, fairies, leprechauns, Metahune in Hawaii, Kami, Kami in Japan. And I've encountered a number of these spiritual entities. They fall under the classification, the spiritual classification of elementals. And elementals are non-human, spiritual, intelligent beings that are more aligned with earth, air, fire, and water, the elements. Now, it's easy to dismiss those as mythological, but I've encountered a number of spiritual intelligences, and they're not necessarily evil. It's just that they're not necessarily interested in human beings. But because people tend to fear what they don't understand, oh, it's a gargoyle. Well, if you see one of these, and maybe it's possible because they're spiritual entities, that if we start using a technology like the Dasein and Die, let's assume for the sake of discussion that what happened with the red light demons was true. Maybe what was happening is now these devices are enabling us to see beyond the visible light spectrum, infrared, beyond the red light, and maybe we are able to see these entities and they're suddenly aware we're able to see them. Once again, it doesn't mean that they're evil or demonic or any negative. They're just simply different.
And therefore curious because they think we can see them.
Exactly.
That's amazing. Is this dye, this, I think you said disenin, is that right?
Disenin, yeah.
Is it a hallucinogen?
No, it's simply like a lens filter. It's a lens filter. And see, that was the concern in Vietnam, was that, well, maybe because Vietnam, the troops had a huge drug problem because, the heroin was,
yeah.
So, well, that's what the thought was, these guys are, they're wasted on heroin. But when, according to Cliff's story, that when people who weren't under any influence or putting these things on at night, they're able to see this. Now, they're replaced in the military with green night vision goggles. Now green takes the human eye into a whole nother spectrum beyond the visible light. And since the military has been using night vision goggles, reports of seeing UFOs has gone off the scale. In fact, I know in Sedona, Arizona, there's actually tour groups that take people out to the desert at night using military night green vision goggles to go on UFO tours to look for UFOs. And people say they see them. I've talked to several people who've seen UFOs. I've done readings for abductees, and I've interviewed them as well, and I've written about it quite a bit. And this is a real thing, especially when you start seeing the U.S. Congress. You have Top Gun fighter pilots. Now, these are the most no-nonsense guys in the world saying, yeah, we see these things, and they're doing circles around the best aircraft the U.S. Air Force has. And so when we start seeing from cabinet level positions on down and congressional hearings, the UFO genie is out of the bottle. It's not just in the US. It's been happening in the UK. It's happened in Canada. I believe it's happened in France. So UFOs are a real thing. And without the risk of being facetious or sarcastic, somebody said to me in an interview, well, maybe it's Russian technology. I said, look, Russia can't even beat Ukraine. You think they got something they could do rings around a US F-18? I don't think so.
It's interesting that, because actually, I don't know whether it was post your interview with Dave or because of some UFO videos I've seen online. I had a look at the night vision goggles to try and see if I could buy some for here, and it's only a certain generation onwards where you can see the UFOs. and that's where they get really expensive, these glasses. But yeah, I'm intrigued by that there are things all around us that we could see had we had the right lens in front of our eyes.
Precisely.
So you mentioned earlier about some people that said they had been in Vietnam and they'd said, no, that's not true.
Right.
Were they people that said they had the glasses?
They said no, they didn't. In fact,
Oh, okay.
one of my colleagues is Colonel Dr. John Alexander,
Hmm.
and I have the greatest of admiration for him. I think he's almost 90 years old now. He may be 90, and he used to be the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. He was also in charge of the U.S. military's UFO project back in the 1970s. So before it was out there, the U.S. military had a UFO project. And he said, Mark, he said, I was in Vietnam. I was special forces, covert operations. If there was such a thing, I would have known about it. But then again,
Yeah, he ain't going to tell you he's under clear off, under order, isn't he?
yeah, yeah. And if John, if you're listening, I'm not saying that you're being, you're concealing anything, but I tend to trust what he's saying. So I asked him about the green night vision goggles, and he said, "Well, yeah, Mark, UFOs are there." And he said the reason people are seeing them with the green night vision goggles, he said, when you start looking for something, you'll find it. He said most people aren't out at night looking for a UFO. Now you put on night vision goggles that give you an expanded spectrum of what you can see, and you're looking. And I said, so are UFOs real? He said, yes, they are. I said, so what are they? He said, the answer is as complicated as cancer. But from what we can tell, it's not a tin can flying through space for 1,000 years, but some type of interdimensional vehicle. In other words, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, nothing can go faster than the speed of light. All right. But, okay, say the aliens come from here and we're here, and that's 1,000 light years, which means at the speed of light, which we don't have the technology to make anything go that fast yet, it would take 1,000 years to get there. But if you created a warp bubble, and I know we're sounding very Star Trekian, and I think you have a Star Wars shirt on, so
I do indeed. Yeah.
we're speaking the same language. According to Mexican physicist Alcubierre, the Alcubierre metric says, which has been ratified by several quantum theorists, that if you create a powerful enough field, you can create a fold in the space-time continuum so that you jump from one coordinate in space-time to another instantaneously. And because you're creating a fold in space-time, which Einstein said was possible, you're not violating Einstein's theory of relativity because you're not technically going faster than the speed of light. You're just sort of whoop, going around.
You're bending the rules, yeah.
Right. And so physicists in current day say that this is possible. We just do not, we meaning planet Earth, just does not yet have the technology to do this. So I think that is a certainly fascinating look at doing this. Then there's another theory that on the quantum level, everything's made of molecules which are made of electrons, protons, or atoms which are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons. And then on the quantum level, which is pure electromagnetic energy, time doesn't exist. It's a very fluid thing. And there is a school of thought, and my friend and colleague Mike Ricksecker talks about this quite a bit, that UFOs could possibly be us from the future coming back to see what's going on now.
I know. I love that thought, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I think it could all be true because the people that I have done readings for as a medium who have claimed to have been alien abductees, let me tell you something. What they encountered was not human.
Can we just park that one? Because I'm going to ask you about that later, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because I think that's a great topic to discuss post the red light demon part of things. Now, since your appearances or work on this topic, have we had people brave enough to build their own pair of these glasses? If we could get this die.
I've talked to people who've tried, and so far they haven't had any success, and they're trying to buy them. And I know people that own some of them that are really, I mean, they're back from I think the 1930s and such. But as far as the Vietnam era ones, I haven't heard of any of those, if they even exist or if they even ever existed. I mean, let me tell you something. If I could get hold of a pair, I'd definitely want to go like out in the desert where it's dark and take a look around and see what you can see.
And you wouldn't live by the fear side of things. You just think, sod it, I'm going for it. I'm gonna have a look.
I talk to spirits every day. I'm not afraid of them. I mean, and I've encountered elementals and it's been like, whoa, but they weren't, evil or scary or out to get me. They were like, so what do you care about me for? I mean, seriously, I mean, they were like, why are you curious? And that's why I tell people, because I do a lot of paranormal investigation, and a lot of people, if you're doing it properly, according to the scientific method, and encountering something and approaching it with an objective analysis, as opposed to, there's demons here and we're going to go find them. You've already flooded your mind with a preconceived notion. When encountering non-human spiritual intelligence, instead of immediately leaping into the arms of Satan, let's observe this entity and compile the data and then analyze it after the fact.
Interesting. Now, obviously, we've talked about the green light part of the spectrum, or the ultraviolet, and towards that end, and we've talked about the other side, the infrared. Are there any other potential spectrum waveforms, or whatever we want to call it, where we might at some stage in the future develop another technology to be able to see other things? Such as, could we then all see spirits because they exist on a certain frequency?
I believe so, and we'd have to find out what that frequency is. And from a vibrational standpoint, we have 5 different brainwave frequencies. We have gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. Gamma is ultra high functioning. That's when you're, doing a calculus exam and you're running your brain at full throttle. Beta is the activities of daily living, the awake state, what you and I are in now. Alpha is when you begin to relax. It's a meditation. It's when you're drifting off to sleep. Theta is deep sleep. And then delta, very little brain wave activity, but that's when your body heals and repairs itself. So, delta is a good thing. The alpha theta border, when you look at it in the hertz, is around 8 hertz, which is a very low, like almost a bass sound. A lot of my colleagues are always saying, we have to raise our vibration, raise our vibration. Well, if you raise your vibration, you go into gamma. Okay. And what happens there is your brain is so working on overload, you're going to block any contact with spirits. So when we use the term raise our vibration, I think that's more of a euphemistic, a description of we're expanding our consciousness and letting go of the tension. Because what happens in spirit communication is when we go to the alpha theta border, and that's what happens when I do a reading, I go from beta to alpha theta within seconds, whereas normally it takes hours for people to get to that point in the sleep state. And that may be the genetic proclivity or genetic recessive trait that I have. And it's operated out of the pineal gland in the brain, where I can go from beta to alpha theta within seconds. So the reason I'm saying this is to communicate with spirits, we have to align our brainwave frequency with the frequency of a spirit. They bring their energy, their frequency down to get that 8 hertz frequency match. At least that's the theory how this works. Why am I saying this? Because frequency, the different bands of all electromagnetic energy, and light is the only form of electromagnetic energy visible to the human eye. If we get the right frequency match in the color spectrum, let's say the elementals are in infrared, maybe human spirits are in ultraviolet, or maybe they're in green or yellow. So if we can determine what the right frequency is, then maybe to answer your question, the answer to your question is yes, provided we find the right frequency.
And is that where the title of your book, The Afterlife Frequency, comes from? Is it that principle?
Exactly. It is I developed the electromagnetic soul theory, and earlier I was, going through like Everything's made of molecules, which in turn are made of atoms, which in turn are comprised of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which in turn are made of the smallest particle of quantum, which is pure electromagnetic energy. That's where the term quantum physics derives. And it is in every great spiritual teacher from ancient times up to now explains the soul, the who and what we are, pre-exists the body, comes into the body, moves on after the body dies. And the first law of thermodynamics in physics states that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. Neuroscience, the study of the human brain, indicates that while the brain is only 2% of the body's weight, it utilizes over 20% of the body's electrical energy. The big user is the heart. It's a pump. Okay, that pump's got to be pumping. But the brain, the brain's like integrated circuits. And so I created the electromagnetic soul theory to describe what we really are, which is pure consciousness, a soul that is eternal electromagnetic energy. So the brain is essentially a hard drive that temporarily houses the EMS, the electromagnetic soul. It comes in the body, then when the body dies, it moves on. And the EMS being, everything is energetically interconnected, Koit. Mm-hmm. It's just that everything operates at different frequencies. And people say to me, well, that is very hard to grasp. My response is, you think? This is something Albert Einstein, it took Albert Einstein and Oppenheimer and Max Planck and Heisenberg and some seriously smart people to come up with quantum physics. But now we're seeing in the 21st century that it is quantum physics, which is beginning to show that people of faith may very well or have been right all along. It's just that they're describing similar phenomena through different terminology. I mean,
through a different lens, essentially, if we want to go on that thing. Yeah.
I mean, when Jesus said we're all brothers and sisters, I mean, that's a nice thing to say. But if we're all electromagnetic energy and we're all energetically interconnected, now let's think about what that means for a minute. Yeah, my body's electromagnetic energy, but so is this pen on the subatomic level. And so is, Koit, the oxygen, the air that we are breathing. So is the light that is in our rooms. So are the radio waves that this program is being broadcast on. So are the rings of Saturn and beyond. So when you start looking at it like this, it's like, yeah, it's like, we're underwater, okay, and the water is this electromagnetic field, and we're just sort of kind of moving through this, but we're part of the water. We're just denser. We're a different frequency than the water, and I think that may be a more helpful analogy to understand that. Now, of course, I've had scientists say, well, there's other forms of energy in the universe. There's nuclear strong, nuclear weak, and gravity. And the nuclear strong and nuclear weak has to do with bonds that are going on in the reactions, like nuclear reactions of the sun. But when it comes to everything else, we're all EM energy.
Yeah. And it's a common theme hitting across all the interviews I'm doing is that most phenomena seem to have that at the heart of it. Magnetic energy.
Yeah, they do. And, it's funny. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Werner Heisenberg. He's one of the founders of quantum physics. He said, I wish I would have discovered Hinduism earlier in life, because the Hindus have been talking about energy and the recycling of energy and the constant flow of energy. So from their philosophical standpoint, if you take with all due respect to our Hindu listeners, if you take the mythological aspects out of it and go to the strict discussion of the energy and the recycling of energy, it basically is describing what we now understand because of quantum physics, except that they figured this out 5,000 years ago.
Well, it reminds me exactly of the oral stories of the Native Americans, etc. There's knowledge there. It's just how they hand it down. But through, again, the lens of modern day, we say, no, that's bunk. Actually, it's not. You just have to look at it correct and get to the source, the pin of the idea, isn't it? Half the time.
I loved I'm sorry, but
That's
because
all
you're
right.
wearing a Star Wars shirt, I love the what was it, The Force Awakens, the last movie that Harrison Ford was in, and he was talking to Rey and to the other guy, and he said, you know, the Force that binds us all together. He goes, the thing about it is, it's true. And George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, he was, I believe he was 16 years old when he was in a horrific car accident and he was pronounced dead.
Oh, I didn't
And
know
then
that.
and then he came back to life. He had a near-death experience. And
Whoa.
every near-death experiencer that I know, including myself, believes that we are all interconnected, not just people, but everything. And he even described this in detail in an interview with Oprah Winfrey. He said everything from rocks to the stars appear to be interconnected. Sounds a lot like the Force, doesn't it?
It really does. And you know what? My last guest I spoke to had said that almost exact same thing, that even the rocks are connected. And then part of you will think, come on, rocks. But it does make sense because we're all the same stuff, aren't we?
Well, where did he get the idea for the Force? From his near-death
Mm.
experience,
I'm
because
gonna have to look into this.
well, if you go to my book, The Afterlife Frequency, there's a chapter called May the Force Be With You.
Oh, quality.
And it's near-death experiences, May the Force Be With You, is in my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency, and I explain this in great detail. And in all of my books, I know I talk a lot about science and quantum physics. I want everyone to understand, please do not expect you're going to be reading a dry algebra calculus textbook. I suffered through enough of that in the practice of law. I am not going to inflict that on anyone. I write my books like they're novels. I want people to be engaged, entertained, but educated. So I'm not just going to throw a barrage of boring material at you. If you want that, feel free to read a United States Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, like that thick.
Yeah, that thick, and then, you know, it gets overturned 10 years later. So
Now, before we get to the bit about the aliens, which I'm really intrigued about, I have one quick question, which I know you can give a very, very quick answer to. Space and time, how are they different here versus the afterlife?
it's the perception. And it's
Ah,
because we're temporarily living in the material world and we're at a lower, slower vibration. And so we're born, we grow old, and we die. Therefore, we think time moves in a linear fashion. But when our EMS, electromagnetic soul, leaves the body and we quantum leap to the afterlife frequency, okay, which is another dimension that runs parallel to this one, then you're tied into the timelessness. Let me give a good example of this.
cool.
I was doing a reading for this woman, and it was over the phone, so I couldn't see her or anything, and which is electromagnetic, communication.
Mm.
Her mother spirit comes through, and her mother says to me, starts talking about a 7-year-old boy connected to her with a problem with his eyes. And my client said, well, I don't have any children, but my sister, whom I'm very close to, and her 7-year-old son, whom I'm very close to, he's been complaining of headaches lately. I said, your mother said, get him to the eye doctor. And now she's giving me the song, Tutti Frutti All Rudy, Tutti Frutti. And I'm singing the Tutti Frutti All Rudy by Little Richard. And she goes, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. I go, look, that's what I'm getting. She goes, well, I know who Little Richard was, but it's not like I'm a fan. That song doesn't make any sense. I go, that's what she wants you to know. So 2 weeks later, Koit, she contacted me and she said, I called my sister, and my sister said, yeah, my son's getting headaches and he's complaining that he can't really see his homework very well. So I'm going to make an appointment to the eye doctor, especially what you're telling me what the psychic said. So she said that she went with her sister and the little boy, and the second that they walked into the doctor's office, on the radio, it started playing Tutti Frutti All Rudy by Little Richard. Now, it's a great story and it's a lot of fun, but let's look at what was going on here. Her mother's spirit, okay, she and her nephew and her sister, corporeal beings, okay, we're pure energy, but at a lower vibration, all right? Her mother is an electromagnetic soul. And as such, being an EMS, she's able to run a quick scan on people. She could tell that her grandson was having problems with his eyes, and she doesn't want her grandson having problems with his eyes. Get him to the doctor. And to let them know that they were in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, she was able to tune into another form of electromagnetic energy, radio waves, in what you and I would call the future, to let them know the second they walked into that office, that's the song that'll be playing. Now, how can she do that? Because an EMS on that quantum electromagnetic level, time doesn't exist. So she was able to perceive what you and I would call the future. And I have seen this happen time and time again. I like that example because it's relatively straightforward and easy one to explain.
It's such a hard one, I think, for humans to get our head around the fact that time doesn't exist when we can perceive it all around us as existing. It's just weird.
Well, yeah, I mean, we grow old and we die. Okay. We look at people we love get old, they get sick, they die. It's very easy for us to believe that time exists. The Hindus believe that with reincarnation, your next lifetime could be what you and I call the past. And that kind of ties into the theory that UFOs could be us from the future. Well, why couldn't our EMS go to the past? Personally, I live in Florida, so I like having air conditioning and indoor plumbing. Okay, so the idea of going back to the 15th century doesn't quite appeal to me, but it might on that afterlife frequency level.
Yeah, amazing. Now if you've got time, can we quickly talk about the spirit messages regarding aliens, because that's like fitting two of my favorite subjects together. So, do we have any example cases where spirits tell us about UFOs, aliens, and abductions? And if so, does that indicate that aliens don't go to the same afterlife as we do?
Let's take this one section at a time. I've done readings for a number of people who claim to be alien abductees. And Nancy Tremaine and Calvin Parker are the two most high profile. Calvin, I'd like to call a friend. Back in 1973, he was 19 years old, and he was from Pascagoula, Mississippi. And Calvin, he was a real Mississippi boy. He had the accent. He was just the nicest guy. And he and a friend, this guy that was 42 years old, they decided to go fishing one day. And he said, so here we are fishing, and suddenly out of the sky comes this large metallic object. And he said they wanted to run, but they couldn't run. Okay. He said they couldn't move. And this light flashed him. These three robotic things came out of it, took them on board. And he essentially described, he said they treated him like a lab rat. Okay. Well, I'm giving the very short version of this because there's a lot written about Calvin Parker. And unfortunately, he died
recently.
Year.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, recently he died. And he was subjected to interrogation by local police, by the FBI. He was given sodium pentothal, so-called truth serum. He was subjected to hypnotherapy and to polygraph, lie detector tests for 50 years and came out 100% truthful every time. He said, Mark, this is not the type of thing you make up. He goes, I was getting married 2 weeks after this. He goes, this did not exactly endear me to my in-laws when I said I had been abducted by aliens from a flying saucer. I mean, he was telling me this. And his friend, Charles Hickson, went public with it. He ended up on Johnny Carson show and all this. And so I did a reading for him, and his relatives in spirit came through to acknowledge that. And they talked to him about that this was part of his mission, and that these aliens they weren't there really to harm him. Now, around that time, I did a reading. It was a public venue, and there was this young man there, and I was drawn to him, and he looked like Like he was just one of these chiseled looks with the big blue eyes. He was like the perfect male specimen. He could have been about 22, 23, but just chiseled, rock hard features. And his grandfather's spirit came through and said, the Grays have come for you more than once. And this young guy started shaking. The tears came out of his eyes. And he said, they come for me. And I said that his grandfather said, these aliens are coming for you because of the way you metabolize protein. And it was like, and they said, that's what makes you different. And you need to change your diet to make you less conspicuous, less interesting. So I was talking to Chris DiPerno from MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. And I know they have branches, and I know you're familiar with them, and I'm sure your listeners are. And he debriefs abductees. And I told him this, and he said, what did you say? I said, yeah. I said, in more than one reading, including Calvin Parker, Nancy Tremaine, this young man, and other people, they all talked about protein, because people are always like, well, why do they only pick certain people? And I told him that. I said, in all these readings, the spirits of the abductees said it's because of the way they metabolize protein. He said, this is really strange. He said, but in every abductee after the event, they cannot get enough protein. He said, one guy we were talking to ripped open a package of hot dogs and ate them raw, couldn't get enough meat. And he says, and this craving never ends. So I called Calvin and I asked him this, and he said, well, that's true, Mark. I can't get enough of the meat. He goes, I always crave protein. And what he told me is that when he was on board, and Nancy Tremaine said the same thing. Apparently she was abducted by the same alien species, and she said that there was these robotic entities, but then there was the most handsome man she had ever seen.
I was not there.
What?
I wasn't there.
You were not there. and from her description, he looked exactly like Koit.
Yeah.
But she said it was like the most attractive man she'd ever seen. But she said then he moved real quickly, and it was like, to describe it, like a hologram, and she saw this reptilian face.
Oh.
So Calvin Parker said these things bring him on board, and there was a woman in charge. He goes, Mark, she was the prettiest girl I ever saw. He goes, if I was at a bar, I would have talked to her. Well, what he told me I did a second interview, second reading for him, was 20 years after the 1973 incident, he was abducted again. He was by himself this time. He was in his truck. He goes, he saw that thing, and he said, damn it, and he was angry. And he said, there was that woman, and he said, this time he punched her as hard as he could. And he said, when he punched her, he said it looked like a crocodile behind the facade. And then the robotic things grabbed him, and he said, and they were not gentle. And the next thing he knew, he was back in his car. And then after that, he started getting sick, and he died of cancer last year. So he felt that they did something to him. And I said, Calvin, why did you punch her? He goes, I was just so angry. And he said, I kind of knew it wasn't a real woman. He goes, I knew they were doing something to me. Now, this makes sense because I've heard that there's the Greys, okay? Yep. They're the gray looking. Then there's the reptilians, the insectoids. Apparently, there are several different species coming from wherever to the Earth. This is what the abductees have told me. And when I do the readings for them, their loved ones in spirit will identify, like, oh, it was a reptile, or for that one young man, the Greys. But what Calvin felt is that they're not here for evil purposes. He said they may have something to do or may be part of a bigger plan to save the world. That's what he told me. So...
But what did the spirits say? Did they give any indication as to what agendas are? Or are they just...
They don't indicate that it's any type of alien invasion. It's not the Borg. It's not the Klingons, the Empire. Okay. They are here studying us, but they are focused on biological processes involving protein. And the discussions I've had with other UFO experts indicate that they may be involved in a hybridization program. And both Calvin Parker and Nancy Tremaine told me they're already here, that there are aliens here already that they've bred using our DNA and theirs. Now, the question is, why are they here? What are they doing? And let's face it, if they can get here from wherever and have that type of technological capability, if they had wanted to conquer us, they would have done so already. So it appears that they're here for reasons other than conquest. And at least that's what they're telling me. Now, I realize how far-fetched this may sound to most people. Remember, I used to be a prosecuting attorney, then a personal injury litigator. I've always tried to be very, very credible, but the thing I have learned is that what exists is far beyond the perception of our limited 5 physical senses of hearing, sight, taste, smell, and touch. And when we're dealing with the universe, and what spirits tell me, there's more than one universe, there's different dimensions, the multiverses, the fact that there's aliens or life on other planets should be no surprise. And people say, why do they come and do this to humans? Well, you ever watch a Smithsonian or a National Geographic or a BBC documentary when scientists want to go study a polar bear? What do? They shoot it with a tranquilizer. Then when it's tranquilized, they go and start taking samples from it. Wow, sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, the agenda there does sound exactly the same. I'm just intrigued about cross messages from spirit re that topic. I imagine you've got loads of them, have you?
Yeah. And you asked another question.
Yes, at the end of that one.
What was that?
If you want, I'll just go. Does it indicate that aliens don't go to the same afterlife as we do?
I've seen no indication of that, and the fact that the abductees, their loved ones in spirit, come forward and talk about this indicates they may have some interaction with them. Also, when we encounter non-human spiritual intelligence, maybe some of those are aliens.
Yeah, that's a mind-blowing thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you know what it is? You and I are finite entities, and our human brain, okay, remember, the brain did not create our consciousness, which is our electromagnetic soul. It merely hosts it the way your computer hard drive hosts the programs on it. For whatever reasons, we are living in these temporary bodies and have a finite perception for a purpose. But beyond that finite perception and beyond our physical beings, we're dealing with the infinite. So when people always say, well, what are my loved ones doing in spirit? What do they do all day? What do they, it's like, well, you're trying to understand infinity through a finite lens. I believe Albert Einstein described it the best. Imagine, what he said, to paraphrase him, a 4-year-old walking into a vast library. The 4-year-old knows that there's things written in the books. He knows that people wrote them, but doesn't understand them. We're the 4-year-old. And that's the way it is. So there is so much beyond our understanding at this point in time. And just because we don't understand something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, what did people think was the cause of disease before the invention of the microscope? Oh, bad vapors at night, evil spirits, all these ridiculous things. And then the microscope's invented and they're seeing fungus and bacteria and viruses. What were the stars before the invention of the telescope? I mean, you read things, they
people.
were
Yeah,
fabric of heaven. Yeah, there are people.
Yeah.
There's all these type of things. And so as technology evolves, like what you said earlier, what you asked about, maybe we can develop some type of vision device that will enable us to see into that afterlife frequency spectrum. Well, maybe we will. We probably will. We just don't have it yet.
Now, these are topics I would really like to expand on in the future, and maybe if you're amenable to it, maybe I'll speak to you again at some other stage, especially regarding your near-death experience. That one really fascinates me. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to quickly enter the Koit Zone. Koit Zone! Now, in the Koit zone, I'll ask you very rapid fire questions. It won't take long, but just answer best you can. Some of them are silly, some of them are straightforward. So, first one, favorite candy?
Heath bars.
Heath bars, did you say?
Heath bars.
I've never had one, but I will look it up now and potentially
It's
get
funny,
one
they're
next time
made
in
in
the
England.
States.
They're made
Oh,
in
are they?
England too.
Oh,
Yeah, it's toffee covered by milk chocolate. It's delicious, and it's got a crunch. It's got all the little bit of crunch, a little bit of salt. It's really good.
could be like a toffee crisp that we have here. I do like
Yeah,
those.
I think that's what it is. Yeah, toffee crisp.
Cool. Then you've chosen wisely. Yeah. What's the biggest injury you've ever sustained?
I would say it's been emotional, losing my parents.
Okay, that's fair, and I'm sorry if I brought that up with that one. Um, what scares you? And I know we shouldn't live by fear, but is there anything that scares you?
The fact that there are narcissistic sociopaths in positions of power of countries that have nuclear weapons.
Yes, and more so is that brought to the point today with the whole Pakistan thing and Iran going at each other.
Iran, and then you have one in North Korea, you've got one in Russia, you got a regime in Iran trying to get this, and it's like it's as if we've released baboons with hammers into a
Yeah,
museum.
yeah, very much so. It is bad. Favorite movie?
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, good choice. Good choice. Who would you really like to converse with in the spirit realm that you've not yet?
I'm trying to think because I've conversed with a lot of the ones that I really like. Um, Cleopatra. Cleopatra the Seventh. I run into people all the time. I think I used to be Cleopatra. There were 7 Cleopatras. The Elizabeth Taylor one was Cleopatra the Seventh. I think she would have been absolutely fantastic to talk to because of her insights, of her relationship with Julius Caesar, what she knew about the Great Library of Alexandria, the power play, having been a descendant of Alexander the Great. I think she would be fantastic to talk to.
Good choice. Good choice. And do you think you'll be able to achieve that? If you, I mean, my question would be: can you just put out a thought? Can I speak to Cleopatra the Seventh? Would it happen?
I need a connection of the person doing the reading. I need a connection to. Like I was doing a reading for somebody once, and her father came through, and then next to him, I said, "God, that looks like Ronald Reagan." And the woman, she was very affluent and older, and I didn't know who she was. And she said, "Well, yeah, Dad used to play golf with Ronnie in California." And I go, "Ronnie?" And then I realized who her father was, this famous billionaire. And then I said, "Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson are standing next to them." She goes, "Oh, them. They used to crash our parties all the time and expect us to pick up the tab because he used to be King of England." And then she goes, "And her, what a shameless social climber." And I'm like, oh my God, I'm talking to these people. And she goes, "Well, of course, I knew them all." And I mean, it was really interesting, but I did not expect that. But the thing is, I can't just get Ronald Reagan or Edward VIII or Cleopatra or anybody to come in without the connection. And I've got a number of stories along those lines. I mean, that's just one of them. If you have me on again, I'll tell you about the reading I did for film icon Shirley MacLaine. Man, that was interesting.
Funnily enough, I also spoke about her last week. There's a lot of coincidences going on here.
Synchronicity.
Yeah, dogs or cats?
I like them both for different reasons. Cats are easier, but I don't have pets because I'm on tour all the time, and I
Yeah,
think
that's fair.
I don't like the way people treat animals. People are cruel. Like when I'm in New York City and I have friends that have dogs and they keep it in a cage all the time until they get home. That's horrifying. Or these people that can't go anywhere without their service animal because they're neurotic. And that poor dog all day long is absorbing that person's neuroses.
Yeah.
It's like about less stress on the dog and a bit more counseling and self-work.
Fair play. No, and I agree with you on that. And that would also probably answer the next question, which is what really annoys you. I think that is pretty much it, isn't it? Unless there's something else.
Well, rude people, rude people, people who speak before they think, people who don't respect boundaries. It comes down to this: treat other people the way you want to be treated. And if everybody did that, it sounds nice. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Sounds wonderful, but it's a lot harder, apparently, than it sounds. So that's what annoys me. Is like I was at a conference, and I spoke about some of the things we talked about here, and then this woman corners me afterwards. Well, where do you live? What was the name of your law firm? Where did you practice? I said, look, I don't give out personal information. And she went ballistic on me. And the funny thing is, I found out she was a psychologist, and a friend of mine, Dr. Mary Neal, who's a world-renowned near-death experiencer, she said, yeah, she said, sounds like a psychologist who needs a psychiatrist.
Yeah, fair play. Last question in the Koit. No, second to last question in the Koit zone. If offered a chance, would you go into space?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my God, yes. In fact, that's always been a dream of mine. Plus, my father worked in the US space program and was actually one of the guys who helped design the lunar module, and also one of the ones who helped figure out how to get Apollo 13 back. And I've been very honored in the course of my life to have met Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, John Glenn, and Bill Nelson, who was a politician that he's now head of NASA, but he went in one of the shuttles, and Captain Mike Foreman. And I got great stories on all of those.
I imagine you would, especially Neil and Buzz. I know there's lots of stuff to do with the UFO side of things there, but let's park that for the future. Last question in the Koit zone before we wrap up. Pick an item from your background and tell us the story of it. Now, you've got a lot in your background. Pick any random item.
Yeah, the statue of Buddha up there.
Yes, I see.
I was in northern Thailand, near the city of Nam, and I was with my friend Billy. I write about him a lot in Evidence of Eternity and in the Afterlife Frequency. And Billy lived in Asia and spoke a number of languages. And we hiked up to the Laotian border, and we were at a refugee village. No running water, no electricity, grass huts. And we're, I'm 6'1". Billy was just about 6 foot, but he was a real big, brawny guy. And, we look like, talk about aliens, look like we beamed down because everybody there was physically smaller and they were terrified of us. And it was really fascinating meeting these people. But then we went to, this is another whole story, but I'll make it short. We went to this Buddhist temple that was so magnificent. When you walked up to it, there was this huge stone pathway, and it was flanked by these enormous stone dragons, all in green. It must have been about 400 feet long. And when we went into the temple, like the polished stone floors, it was so spiritual. I mean, the monks with the robes, and we were the only Caucasian people like that we saw all week. And they were very polite to us. And I said, well, I'd like to give you some money. And they said, would you like to buy this image? But they didn't just want to take money. So I gave them that. I said, well, how much? And I was looking at it going, this is really beautiful. I figured like $100. This is $5. And I'm,
whoa.
But that was like enough money to feed them for a year.
Jeez.
I mean, this is, and so that was like, Indiana Jones, when he gets that golden idol and that's what I felt like. And every time I look at that, I think about how spiritual those monks were, how beautiful that was. And it just fills me with a sense of calm and awe. So in a sense, I took a little bit of that harmony with me.
And you brought it into the room. Is that on an elephant? Is that what that is underneath it?
Yes, that is. Yeah, that's on an elephant.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. Thank you. That's the end of the Koit Zone, and I will end with the last question, which is, what are you currently working on?
Oh my gosh, a lot of projects. My speaking tour, my Psychic Explorer 2024 speaking tour. I'll be talking about interdimensional communication and the science of the afterlife. Another talk is called Debunking Death, the Science of Reincarnation and Near-Death Experiences, and also the healing power of spirit communication and healing from grief. To name a few, my weekly show, The Psychic and the Doc on Transformation Network. And if people want to find out about these, and please visit my website, which is afterlifefrequency.com, just like my latest book, Afterlife Frequency. And I invite all of you to sign up for my newsletter. And Koit, I want to thank you so very much. You're a fantastic interviewer. And to all the listeners, keep tuning in. God bless all of you. Namaste.
And thanks ever so much for saying that. And by the way, check out the links in the description. They'll all be there. So all the links to Mark's site. So go and check that out. And thank you for being here. To watch other KoitCast episodes, please click the image top left. To subscribe to my channel, please click the image top right. Please like and share to help KoitCast grow, and most importantly of all, please click the notification bell so you never miss an upload.